We have a terrific panel. My name is David Shore, I should say, of the Stanley Foundation, and am joined by colleagues from the other sponsoring organizations, Nina Hichigian from Center for American Progress, Parag Khanna from New American Foundation, and Matt Iglesias, also from Center for American Progress, each of whom has made a really great, not only a great contribution to these issues, but I think one that's going to make for a very complementary, they're going to fit well with each other. Nina has written a fully articulated strategy for the United States to deal with this world. It's policy relevant and policy prescriptive. Parag has given us a theory of everything, or nearly everything, and Matt has written a book about the politics of foreign policy, and of course, foreign policy traces back to politics inevitably. Matt is a well-known blogger. If you read just one blog, it should be Democracy Arsenal, which is where I blog. But if you read two blogs, then you should read Matt on Think Progress. Now I happen to have my own copies of each, both for ready reference and to serve as an example. All are on sale out there. Why, thank you, Matt. This bipartisan foreign policy is also available from the book sale if bipartisan foreign policy is still possible, or we believe it's still possible. I see the questions for this panel as we're going to ask, what are the prospects for a 21st century concert of powers? Do we see enough convergence among power centers that such a thing is possible? What will be required of the United States to help solidify a healthy international order? And then how do American domestic politics match up with international politics? And I'm going to turn to Nina first. From my reading of your and Mona's book, you really seem to be kind of the serene one on these issues. How do you do it?
She lives in LA.
In all seriousness, I mean, part of that, I guess, is believing that the rising powers aren't out to upset the apple cart. Fair enough, but why should we be optimistic about the constructive role that the U.S. can play and how effective the U.S. can be? I mean, isn't everyone tired of us, or are we up to it?
Those are excellent questions, hard questions, David. But I'm not sure I'd call myself serene, but I am, I think, optimistic, and appreciate the chance to explain that. Given circumstances, it must seem it's a crazy time to be optimistic, but I am. I think partly it's keeping in mind a historical perspective that it's actually a pretty good time to be a dominant power, because for hundreds of years, the pattern was, you had a dominant power, other powers would rise, they would knock off the dominant power, and there was almost, there's warfare in almost every case. And we had sort of a nation-eat-nation world for a long time. And that's not the world we live in now. We don't have to worry about being conquered by China or India or Russia in any sort of physical sense. That's partly because of our oceans, but it's also because of how our security paradigm has really shifted. You can no longer conquer another country and expect to use their most valuable resource, which is the brains of their people. conquering for resources doesn't make a lot of sense anymore when you've got commodities markets and you can just buy the oil or the iron or whatever else it is that you need. And we now also, I think, have a really profound economic interdependence, which I think has an effect to dampen direct sort of head-to-head security competition. And people say that Germany and Britain traded before World War I, and that's the case, but it's like nothing we've ever seen. I mean, we literally own pieces of each other's economies. And we also have, I think, a genuinely new security interdependence because of the issues that John and Steve talked about earlier. We can't fight global warming alone, even if we wanted to. And nothing would make Al-Qaeda happier than if the U.S. and Russia went to war, or cold, hot, or of any kind. So, and we're all nuclear powers. So I think that whole set of issues makes it a different era than we used to be, and less direct head-to-head competition with other major powers. Could we enter a conflict? Of course, we certainly could, but there's a lot of factors, more than there have been in the past, trying to pushing us in the other direction. And then I've also looked at, in doing the research for the book, Mona and I tried to be pretty objective about how the rise of these powers affects American interests. And I was surprised to find there's definitely downsides, but there are also opportunities. And if you look at the issues that Americans care most about, you can see those opportunities. So the economic rise of these other countries has brought hundreds of millions of their own people out of poverty in India and China and Russia. And we should, as a progressive, I feel like I should applaud that. But it has also grown our economy. I mean, those spoils are not being shared by the working class, as John pointed out, but nevertheless, it is not a zero-sum situation. Their growth can mean our growth as well. And then with the forces that have actually killed Americans in America, so terrorists that have killed thousands, disease that has killed millions, global warming that, depending on what you think of Katrina, has killed thousands already and could get worse, that we have to work with the other powers to fight those forces, and it's in their self-interest to do that as well. So to some degree, we are in the same boat. Now, the second part of your question, can we pull it off, is harder. I mean, in some ways, it's really in our hands. I mean, what we do in terms of our domestic agenda has much, much more to do with our eventual success than what China or India or Russia does. And that, in some ways, is good news, because here we are. We can do it ourselves. We don't. It's within our control, but as we've seen, we haven't been stepping up to the plate. We haven't been investing in education and innovation and worker empowerment and all that. I'm optimistic, though, that in this election, these issues have come up in a way that they haven't before. I mean, we've got two candidates who both agree that there is climate change. And one has a more robust agenda than the other, but they both agree it's a problem. They both talk about education. They both are talking about health care and universal health care. And I won't go into why, but all those domestic agenda items are what we need to really push through in order for America to thrive in this new world. We also have to lead in a different way, and I'm also somewhat confident that, as John was saying, that the neoconservative approach has been such a colossal failure that we would have, that either president would approach the world a little bit more differently.
So it sounds like necessity is the mother of cooperation. Parag, as someone myself who shares your tendency to think of international relations as kind of a market competition for support and alignment, I really like your idea of a set of middle powers as sort of swing voters. So tell us the winning strategy for America to pick up those votes. If you're the political strategist for Candidate USA, what kind of campaign do you want to run?
I thought Matt was going to do that part, but let me start. Thanks a lot, David. I want to kind of frame my comments around two axioms of history which I think are more powerful than us and shape a lot of how I think about these issues, and these are constraints that we face and have to deal with no matter what. And the first is that power abhors a vacuum. You've all heard it and it never applies more than to the world than today. It's a very complicated world with many more powers and players and so forth, and far more issues, transnational and otherwise, more than any one superpower, even the United States, can handle. And because in the last 18 years we haven't been able to singularly manage that world, other powers have come in. It's a structural phenomenon, like globalization itself. So globalization is that new power that fills that vacuum and empowers China, Russia, India, and all others to rise up, because we haven't been able to unilaterally impose that. So power abhors a vacuum, new powers rise. Again, it's a law of history. The other is, who has the money makes the rules. Again, very sort of ancient principle that's again at work today in everything we see when we talk about currency reserves, sovereign wealth funds, and so on. This is also at play. And a lot of the countries that I talk about in my book are the ones that are amassing that money and changing the rules. But what it all adds up to is a question that we spoke about earlier, which is revisionism. I think that the one area where Mona and I aren't totally in agreement. Sorry, she's the only one. Here.
It's okay, it happens all the time.
I knew Mona before I met you. Where Nina and I somewhat disagree is this question of revisionism. I think that it's a 20th century view to believe that in order to declare a power revisionist, it somehow needs to already offer an off-the-shelf complete ideological package of what that alternative world looks like. That's not actually the case. All you need to do is to undermine the existing order and blame the failure of that order on the sort of incumbent. And that's precisely what's happening today. Let's just take the example of China. I don't know what revisionism is if it is not the following things, which is, founding the Shanghai Cooperation Organization to manage collective security and energy policy and so forth in Central Asia, binding India, Japan, Australia, and others economically closer to itself so that they are less reliant allies of the United States, providing financial, strategic, all kinds of assistance to every country that the United States wants to isolate and call a rogue state, and setting up independent development agencies that compete with the US and the European Union and Africa and other developing countries. If that isn't bottom-up revisionism of the pre-existing order, again, I don't know what is. And the other factor, again, is globalization, which is this perpetual, relentless distribution of power that weakens either American or Western or any centralized institutions such as the United Nations. And let's turn to that. This notion that's out there that if we reconnect with the United Nations, then we can lead a new international order. I don't believe that if we were to develop the consensus to back the UN, that others would necessarily share it. And that applies as much to, believe it or not, the European Union as anyone else. In the 1990s, when the European Union was substantially weaker than it is today, it used to put United Nations international law and mandates of the Security Council above its own deliberations. It no longer does that. The EU holds itself to be the highest normative regulatory force and moral there in the world, which quite frankly it is compared to us. And so they no longer are going to buy into that. They're also blocking UN reform. What is our proposal for that? 18 years, no UN Security Council reform. As much our fault as actually Europeans' fault, but it's not actually going to happen. China, again, has not said we want an alternative to the United Nations. In fact, it's Americans who have said we need a League of Democracies instead. So in every which way, I don't see the new order, if there is to be a new concert, for example, in any way centralized through the UN. It would have to require the kind of diplomacy that I try to suggest in the end of my book, which is very much a functional, issue-based sort of thing. So what is our common interest on climate? How does the technology go from one to the other? Who pays for it? Sort out the IPR issues and so on. That same thing with the same model of functional cooperation on terrorism, on rogue states, on development assistance and good governance. Wherever you can do it amongst the key players, principles, powers, that's how you do it. But don't have a bias towards particular institutions that are quite simply outdated. So that would be, to me, the first step in the new diplomacy among all the new powers.
Flexibility about where to look for the international
Absolutely.
order. Yeah. So we have a difference over to what extent the matters are contested today. Matt, have we learned anything in the last 8 years as a political culture? Have these new power realities that we're talking about changed the domestic foreign policy debate at all? Do you see signs of any shift?
I was looking at some polling recently, preparing. I had a hint that this question was going to come to me. I was looking at it, and it was about this sort of dramatic change in public opinion, actually, a much more sort of inward-looking American public that, in response to energy concerns and economic problems, now wants to see the United States much less involved with world problems, and a lot of other switches. But I also saw recently a presentation by a guy who used to be high up at the Gallup organization, and he was sort of talking about how he'd become a little disillusioned with polling. And one example he gave had to do with polling that Gallup did about Iraq back in 2003, right before the war. And they had these results which showed that most people favored going to war. And he said, though, that they also did follow-up questions where they asked people of both sides, well, would you be upset if the country wound up not doing what you want? And it turned out that about half of people, both about half of the people who wanted to go to war and about half of the people who didn't want to go to war, said, no, I wouldn't be upset if the president decided to go the other way. And he said that that's sort of consistently actually the result, that the sort of broad middle of public opinion is pretty much prepared to back policy, whatever that policy is. If the president says we need to do this for our security, people will say, okay, we probably do. If he doesn't, they'll say, okay, it is what it is. So to some extent, there's, I think, more leeway than people in Washington sometimes understand in terms of what you can get away with doing if you're actually governing as opposed to sort of talking in opposition. But that still leaves you with the question of, I think, elite opinion and what is the conversation that's happening. And, a lot has changed, obviously, but it's striking to me how much hasn't really changed. When the discussion about Russia that happened previously, it was sort of finally brought up that, it's a little strange to see Americans so upset about the idea of, one country, you can't invade other countries, but when, of course, that's what we've been doing. And I think it would be facile to say that American behavior in Iraq justifies Russian behavior vis-a-vis Georgia. But the question is, why is it that there's such a level of outrage when Americans see Russia behaving in this kind of unilateralist bullying manner? People say, well, that's appalling, that's outrageous. And then they start wondering, well, what does this mean about Russia? We have this very essentialized conception, they're rebuilding a Russian empire. It's going to be a new Cold War. But if you were to write things, if you were to try to say that the United States' behavior vis-a-vis Iraq, trying to sponsor a coup in Venezuela about 7 years ago, various things with regard to Haiti, our attempted coercion, economic bullying of Cuba, and say, well, this proves that America is an evil power, hell-bent on world domination, completely disrespectful of the rule of law, I would become a completely marginalized figure in the United States. But to say those kind of things about other countries, simply because those countries, try to advance their interests, sometimes in ways we don't like, is sort of seen as par for the course. And I think that as we move to a world where America is still the leading power, but we don't have the sort of overwhelming preponderance of power that we had in the 1990s, you're going to need a conversation in the United States that's a little more self-conscious and a little more respectful of what the points of view of elites elsewhere in the world are. And not even to say that we need to agree that the way Russians or Chinese or Indians see the world is correct or equally valid as the way we do, but just to recognize that that's the world as it is, that Americans look at America in a special way because Americans are patriotic, but Russians are patriotic too, but they're Russian patriots, not American ones. And I don't think we're really at a point where it's yet considered acceptable to really sort of take seriously other points of view in that way.
Other hearts and other lands are beating. No, point taken. We have a little ways to go yet on self-awareness.
Just a little.
Back around to Nina. Turning what Parag referred to as the question of revisionism on its head a little bit. Certainly, if a stronger international community, a stronger consensual global order is going to be built, then going along, we're going to need more than just acquiescence from the other power centers. What are we going to need, and what are the prospects there?
Yeah, I actually think that is probably one of the most difficult challenges we face, which is this issue of getting the other powers to step up and to be constructive players. But before I answer that, I just wanted to answer Parag's point on the revisionism. I mean, to me, you can call it revisionism, but that's just China looking out for its self-interest. I mean, that's what nations do. So, I mean, China considers us to be a security threat, and we're the ones who have troops stationed all around them. And so it's not a surprise that they would try to build, close economic relationships with all their neighbors. That's also economically good for them. So, and not a surprise that they would try to do military exercises with Russia and with the other Central Asian republics. That's what nations do, but I don't think that answers the question of whether they are willing to be a constructive player in the world order. But in any case, so transitioning to the world order, I mean, I think what is that I think the signs have been somewhat positive about China wanting to be a constructive player, at least on their own terms, and of course that they will try to set some of the rules. But that when you look at their work with us on North Korea in particular, and on their history of non-proliferation, they were wild proliferators, and now have really signed on to a whole variety of accords to try to keep nuclear weapons, somewhat under control. But the question is, how do you, especially with China and Russia and India, I mean, these countries are still poor to some degree. And so the idea of trying to convince them to use their energy and their money toward fixing global problems is not an easy sell, especially when they suspect that we are going to try to dominate everything. So I think what we first need to do is make a genuine effort to bring them in. I mean, there is not an international organization where all these powers are a member. And so there's a journal called the Washington Quarterly, and me and my co-author Mona have a piece that's in there in this current issue that talks about expanding the G8 to the G13. I mean, the G8 is like so boring and completely useless, and it's boring and useless because it doesn't have the right players. You can't fix climate change without China, and so anyway, so the idea of bringing in these other powers, but it's not just the G8, it has to also be the IMF and the World Bank and all these institutions that really are completely flawed, but are what we have at the moment to try to solve some seriously big problems. We have to make a genuine effort to bring them in, and in return, expect more from them. Expect that they will be part of the solution. And if you look at the areas where the Bush administration has sort of abdicated leadership, you do see some of these powers stepping up. And North Korea is one example where, for a while there, the Bush administration sort of refused to negotiate, and you couldn't really get anywhere with that. But at the same time, China did step up, hosted the meetings, tried to make progress completely in their own self-interest, but in our interest as well. And on climate change, you see the EU and Japan taking a lead, even though we had not committed to any set reductions. So it's not easy, and I think it's going to be a pattern of one step forward, two steps back. But I think I can't envision another world that's going to work. And the fact is that it is in our collective self-interest to solve some of these problems.
I actually want to segue to Parag very much in that vein. Part of your theory of everything is to identify, you consciously refer to them as empires, but basically, the major poles of power in today's world. China, the EU, and the U.S. Do you see a convergence there? I mean, do you see that they're after some of the same things that that would make you optimistic too?
I think it really depends issue by issue, right? Because we don't see, if that were true, then we would see a common effort towards institutional reform through the existing channels, and we don't see that, as I said earlier, and therefore the macro answer is no. But I want to get to, I think there's a deeper kind of desire lurking in it. There's this assumption that we all have in this room and elsewhere that there is such a thing as the world order right now. We've said it so many times since this conference began this morning, the new world order. And I won't even do a real, sort of showing of hands, but it just occurred to me now, we do not have a new world order right now. World order has a very, very simple, clear definition in political science, and that is a stable distribution of power. We do not have a new order. We have the Middle Ages right now, the new Middle Ages. We have multinational corporations, mercenaries, and crusades, and powers, and empires. That was somewhere the year of 800 to 1600. That's what we have today. We do not have, and therefore this intrinsic hope and desire to construct a new world order that looks something like an extension of the 20th century is absolutely doomed to fail. We are jumping back 1,000 years in history before we ever get to that point again. So I have to challenge the very logic of the question in a way. In fact, if I were to write the whole book again, I would not have wanted to be perceived as about China, America, and the EU, because it's much more about 40 other countries and what they do. And what I see them doing is as you say, pursuing their own interests. There isn't even clear alignment anymore. I call it multi-alignment. And the places where I've traveled, Saudi Arabia, Kazakhstan, Libya, Indonesia, they don't pick one side or the other. They pick everyone at the same time. They say, we'll take some military aid from you, we'll trade a bit more with you, we'll ally ourselves politically with you, we'll vote for you with you. And this agency, but everyone is going after whatever they can get in terms of alliances. And so you have literally total diplomatic chaos. And that's precisely what we have today. So to me, it hinges much less than I've previously emphasized on what the US, EU, and China do, and much more, actually, on satisfying the needs of these countries that can get what they want from others besides us.
Okay. So neither serene nor optimistic, then.
No, to say the least.
At least one more question before we turn to for Q&A from the audience. Matt, you were saying earlier that you think particularly the political middle in the country is malleable and taking a kind of or whatever attitude. A little bit more positively, though, is there anything that politics and politicians can speak to in the American electorate that that wants whatever good can be made in these dark Middle Ages that we're in?
Right. You know what? I think you do see.
I think you lost your mic there.
Oh. There's a sort of tremendous upsurge, I think you see, in public desire for international cooperation. In particular, overwhelmingly, much more positive reactions to that phrase you see it in all kinds of things. And that ties in part with people's sense that there are problems in other non-sort of foreign policy domains, and in part a recognition of the kind of the failures of the Bush years, because the neoconservative approach was at least always presented to the public as an extremely noble undertaking. It's not sold as a doctrine of bullying and kind of coercion, but as a sort of a doctrine about how awesome America is and all the wonderful things we allegedly were going to be able to do by kind of casting restraint aside and going our own way. And clearly that hasn't worked out. The costs have been enormous, and it's hard to say what problems we've solved. So I think people are looking to see, they want America to some extent to ask more from the rest of the world, but also to do more to get help from the rest of the world. There's increasing awareness that other countries, that China, that Europe, that Japan, that India, that these are at least important countries, that a lot of people live there, they have a lot of money, and that, you know, we should be working on some kind of solutions that involve pooling those resources if the problems genuinely are global in nature and of concern to everyone, which is what we, like any country, is at least always claiming to be tackling global problems. And a lot of the problems we want to tackle, I mean, nuclear proliferation and climate change and transnational terrorism really are global problems that really ought to be tackled in a global way. I do think it gets a little bit more problematic when you get into sort of crisis mode, when things come out in the headlines. You know, people's instincts are still very much, we need to rely on ourselves, which in part shows that if you're going to govern well, you know, you need to govern to some extent proactively, not, you know, I think a sound approach to the world isn't an approach to managing crises. It's an approach to trying to prevent, you know, the worst crises, at least, from occurring.
Kind of a more benevolent shaping.
Right. One hope.
Yeah, we'll turn to you all for questions, starting here and then here.
Hi, I'm Ron Stoltz from Sandia National Laboratories. We're a large government R&D defense and energy laboratory. One of the words that hasn't been said, but I've been thinking a lot about it, is exceptionalism, American exceptionalism. This is probably more to Matt, but all of the panelists. Steve asked the question of, well, what is Europe? And I asked myself, well, what is America? If there isn't American exceptionalism from kind of a moral standing in the world. And can we get beyond that idea of exceptionalism in order to be more cooperative? Or does it mean, does being American meaning we have a moral standing and a moral imperative in the world? And I've been wrestling with bi-coastal. I live on both coasts, but I travel through the heartland, and I can see a move towards more internationalism and respect on both coasts. But in the heartland, I still see this idea of a moral standing in the world. So I just wanted you to react to that. Can we be Americans without this idea of a moral place in the world?
Thanks.
Well, you know, I think it's great that Americans see ourselves as having a role of sort of moral leadership in the world. I think that's, you know, sort of an asset of the country. Where it becomes problematic is when you decide that everyone in the world agrees with us about our exceptional moral mission, and that, you know, what you hope people can understand is that, you know, missions that we give ourselves, if they're good, that's excellent, and that we ought to have high aspirations, but that we can't expect foreign populations to instinctively think about the United States in the same way that Americans think about the United States. That if we want to be seen as benevolent, we need to take seriously what other people in fact think about our actions, not what we think they should think about them.
Just to quickly add to that, I mean, I think we are exceptional. We are still have the largest economy by a long stretch. The largest military, the most innovative society, et cetera, et cetera. So I mean, in a lot of ways, we are exceptional. And the question, I think, is, and I think that the morality of our foreign policy is not going to go away. I mean, I would argue, I think that we are more ideological of a power than China or Russia are. I mean, at least China is just extremely pragmatic. But I mean, I think the issue is, and I don't think that any of that is necessarily bad. It's about the methodology you use. You can promote democracy in ways that is welcome to the countries in which you are promoting it, and then you can invade Iraq. And so it's more about that, I think, and so I don't see that yearning for American exceptionalism to be a bad thing at all. I agree with Matthew. It's just about channeling it and saying perhaps that, well, China's an exceptional country too. It's got more people than anywhere else in the world, and India is pretty exceptional for its own reasons. So broadening the concept, perhaps.
Thanks. Here and then here and then. Yep.
Good morning. I'm Tom Hayden. I have a couple of questions about the home front, and I think they're related. One is, I don't know how we'll ever get around to the 60-year-old pledge for national health insurance and the other fine domestic initiatives being discussed if the future is a long counterinsurgency war, occupation, and quagmire from the Middle East to Pakistan and Afghanistan. Guns and butter didn't work in my day. I don't see it in the future. So how do we get from your national security paradigm to making the United States at home at least have the quality of life of the Europeans? Second, related to that, in this discussion of national security, I've been waiting. Matt did make a couple of references to individual countries, but Latin America is always left out of the equation. I don't know if it's because they don't have nuclear weapons. They've got a lot of people. They've got a lot of resources. Most important to me, living here, 30 to 50% of the people in this area are Latino in origin. And they will be the largest block of voters in the United States in our lifetime. And so our policies towards Latin America, or lack of policies, either the Monroe Doctrine through CAFTA, NAFTA, WTO, et cetera, embargo of Cuba, hostility towards the democratically elected government of Venezuela, arming $500 million a year to the Colombian regime, which is a narco regime against narco guerrillas. I don't really quite understand where this is going, but I'm very uncomfortable with discussions of power that leave out Latin America, because that's our, to me, that's our domestic future. It's not that I have little disinterest in these other countries. I spent 6 years of my life trying to stop the war in Iraq. I'll continue, but I always get fog when I hear people discussing national security, and you don't count unless you've got a nuclear bomb or you're in a, quote, strategic relationship with the United States. Why isn't Latin America?
Parag, as you say, the book is about 40 countries, no, not 2 countries in a political union. So please, if you would, on
I feel your pain. I know where you're coming from. I had to fight with my publisher to keep the Latin America section of my book in and to have it be as long as the others, and it is. And I went and spent quite some time in various South American countries, and I argue that Latin America is important, again, as important as any other continent, because of globalization, allowing resources to be accessible faster than ever before, and allowing, due to the sort of end of the Cold War and the demise of the Monroe Doctrine psychology in the hemisphere, allows China and others to move into Latin America much more rapidly, accessibly, and willingly than ever before. So Latin America is very much a playing field in the 21st century, particularly given its vast natural resources. And I argue for kind of a 21st century version of the Alliance for Progress from the 50s and 60s, in which there was a great deal of investment in improving the manufacturing capacity of Latin America, and such that we could actually outsource there rather than the Far East, reduce our costs considerably, though perhaps less than would otherwise be the case, but at least within our own hemisphere, reestablish a certain amount of geopolitical collegiality, which doesn't really exist today. But in geopolitics, having resources within your own hemisphere is a much more secure way of shoring up your own kind of resource base and position globally vis-a-vis competitors than by simply outsourcing to the lowest sort of price factor kind of place like China. So I completely agree that we need to have some kind of a reconnection there, but it hasn't happened yet. And the fate of the free trade area of the Americas in those negotiations is not promising at this point in time. But I would like to see the next president, whoever it is, make that really one of the top 3 priorities, actually, because it's an investment in energy security as much as anything else that we could do in the world.
And speaking of priorities, either of the other of you on the trade-offs and tensions between the domestic and international challenges and agenda.
I don't think I have more to say than I agree with you, and I think the Center for American Progress and Brian and Katulis in particular, who you'll hear from later, has been, you know, kind of at the forefront in trying to get us out of the Iraq War. I mean, we had a whole exit strategy written up, you know, in 2005. So, I mean, I agree with you. We ought to be, you know, trying to work on healthcare and not be in Iraq.
Here, then here, then here.
My name is Mike Medavoy, and I have a question. It relates actually to the bugaboo that nobody really talks about, which is religion in the sphere of world order, especially when you talk about morality. You know, with nuclear proliferation and a threat of nuclear annihilation, I don't think we're in the Middle Ages. I think we're getting closer to the Dark Ages. And you know, that's a big specter in the room. And I'd love you guys to.
Yeah, the two things that you're not supposed to talk about with strangers, you know, politics and religion. So, religion.
You know, I think the role of religion can actually sometimes be overstated in some of these conflicts. I mean, we've just seen that when the stars are aligned correctly, you know, two Eastern Orthodox Christian countries can have serious geopolitical disputes there. And if you look at the Caucasus, where you have Christians there and you have Muslims there, and you also have a lot of conflicts, but it doesn't line up as the Christians all together against the Muslims altogether. It lines up along with the sort of the logic of the power dynamics there. You see in other parts of the world, you know, I think religion becoming something of a proxy for struggles, where you have people from different faiths having conflicts of interest with one another. But I'm not sure that it's right to say that those kind of disputes are really about religion in a sort of core sense, in a way that maybe things were in the Middle Ages, although I'm not even sure if they were really about religion then.
So we're still fighting over the Samuel Huntington thesis, apparently, of the clash of civilizations. Okay, so we agree.
Yeah, if I can, I mean, if I may. I don't share the assumption that a religious frame is necessary to understand any of major conflicts today. I think that religion is, as Matt said, a proxy, and you name the conflict, and we can talk about how religion is in fact simply instrumentalized to justify certain classes that are about more material kinds of, you know, sort of political matters. And the Caucasus is one good example where, in fact, today you have, you know, Iran for a long time having a strong relationship with Armenia and with Russia, so Shia Iran, Orthodox Armenia against Shia Azerbaijan because they have a mutual interest in a border dispute and tensions there. And there's many such examples. And then even in the Middle East, you'll find the ways in which we impose, in a way, religiosity on the more prosaic agendas of groups like the Muslim Brotherhood without necessarily clear evidence of how religious their policies are, how motivated they are by religion as such, rather than instrumental opposition to incumbent regimes and so forth. So I think that we can, and we do far too much, you know, err on the side of believing that one can explain conflicts through religion, and I think it's important to deconstruct each and every one, and it will not add up to a picture of the clash of civilizations.
All the way in the back here, then over here, and I'm looking.
Thanks. I wrote mine down. My name is Payam. I had a question regarding the topic of decline, but economically oriented question. We're facing a pandemic credit crisis not seen since the 1930s. Should this crisis weaken the dollar eventually to the point where foreign majority holders of our treasury bonds need to diversify their holdings elsewhere for higher yield, how would that affect our hegemonic economic capabilities vis-a-vis the fiscal authorities of the World Bank, IMF, organizations like the OECD, and even our abilities to dictate price parameters for OPEC?
I can just take the beginning of that maybe. And I mean, I think it's something to seriously worry about, which is another good reason why we need to balance the federal budget. I mean, and I think, I'm not that there's there's been discussion of the kind of the the possibility that China would rapidly sell off its treasuries and therefore create a huge financial calamity in the United States. And I don't see that as a very likely possibility, just because it would hurt their own self-interest greatly, unless of course we were in a clash over Taiwan and we were already engaged in some sort of major conflict, which I don't see as likely either. But I think what you're saying is the slow erosion of our position is happening. I mean, they are diversifying, and it is happening, and I think it will, we've been able to get by so far because of the fact that we print we print dollars and they're taken everywhere. I mean, Argentina, no other country could have gotten away with the fiscal position that we've been in, and look what's happened. So, I mean, I agree with you, and I think that there is that potential for our slide.
I would just echo that we're already well underway towards what you're describing, and you can see it in oil pricing, other commodity pricing. You can see it in the currencies in which countries are denominating their debt. You can see it in diversification of currency reserves towards something more sort of G4-ish. All of that is already well underway, and our monetary policy is kind of hanging on a prayer because it hasn't caught up to that reality yet.
I'm clearly not doing as well as Matt Miller on gender balance, so I'm scanning the audience still. Please.
I'm Mike Interrogator from UCLA and the Milken Institute. I want to pick up on Parag's point about the Middle Ages. You know, the Harvard philosopher George Santayana, in a book published in 1905, said, "Those who forget history are condemned to repeat it." I think it's a valid warning today. Several people have talked about slipping back into a Cold War, which I think is certainly possible, particularly after Cheney.
Or the Dark Ages, apparently.
No, I'm talking about the Cold War, but I want to go on from there. After Cheney visits Ukraine, this could very well happen, and I think people are talking about that. But I have a more serious problem, which is the kind of world we live in, which is the focus of this whole conference. A post-hegemonic world, a world of multi-hegemons, is very similar to the world where the World War I broke out, based on one incident, assassination of the Archduke, led to the First World War, biggest war up to that point in history. And we're setting up a system today that has a lot of similarities to that system, the pre-1914 system. And so I think Santayana's warning is well taken, and people are not focusing on that issue.
Mm-hmm. I don't agree with you. I think that it's a very different situation from pre-World War II, and I have a feeling that Prague will probably will agree with you, so this will be good. I think that that the economic interdependence that we have today is just very different in character from pre-World War I. It is not only different in scale, and I think it's much greater, but it's also different in character in the sense that we have a great deal of foreign direct investment among all these powers. I was, the Brussels beverage company, InBev, just bought the King of Beers. It turns out the King of Beers, Budweiser, and Anheuser-Busch own stakes in Qingdao, the Chinese beer Qingdao. Yeah, Qingdao, I had it right, okay. Qingdao, as well as a large stake in Corona. So that's just a small example, but it's everywhere. The fact that and so I think that doesn't mean we can't have a head-to-head battle, but it's a new and constraining factor, I believe. Nuclear weapons are another new and constraining factor. These are all nuclear powers, and that provided some measure of deterrence during the Cold War the first time. I know that that's disputed, but I believe it did, at least to some degree. And finally, as I mentioned, the security interdependence. We could all go into a big war, and then we are all, our major cities are all going to be underwater from global warming. And as I said, like Al-Qaeda would like nothing better than to have the major powers be in a major war. So, of course, powers do things against their self-interest all the time. That's how wars begin. But I don't think it's right to say that it's just the way it's always been. I think globalization has really changed things.
Well, I guess, what worries me is that the sort of the one exception to the kind of Norman Angel world of economic interdependence like that has to do with energy and natural resources. And I think it's not a coincidence that those are where we do see the most sort of old school style conflicts have to do with countries that have oil reserves or natural gas reserves or pipelines through which those resources are transferred. That this is the scenario where people don't say, well, it's just as good to sort of have trade and make investments. People say, no, we really want boots on the ground. We want to build a weird, snaky pipeline so that we don't depend on the Russians or the Iranians. But then the Russians say, well, maybe we want to control the country your pipeline goes through. And so we say, no, and there are problems in that regard, which goes back to, there are other reasons to think that we should be trying to move off of dependence on these kind of fossil fuels, good environmental reasons, good economic reasons, and if we move toward an equilibrium where all of the major powers are cooperating to try to move to a post-oil economy, then we'll be, I think, on a cooperative path. But if we don't do that, we'll instead see more and more kind of conflicts over those resources and the countries that have them.
There's areas where the pre-World War I analogy is useful and where it isn't. It's not useful in talking about direct territorial invasion, or something like that among the great powers in the 21st century, but it is useful in your point about the spark coming from a peripheral area, and there's many such places today where empires or superpowers are in conflict and tension, and where there would be, such as in Georgia potentially, or in Turkmenistan, or in the Gulf of Aden, or in the Straits of Malacca, or over Taiwan, a certain spark where clearly the interests of Russia, China, US, and Europe are not clearly aligned, and you will find those proxy wars potentially sort of spiraling out of control. And I certainly think that is the primary risk of conflict that we face today. Energy security or energy supply is more likely than not to be the spark for it.
The last two questions, and we're going to take them simultaneously and wrap up. So here and there.
Yeah, my name is John Fay. I'm with the Party Rand Graduate School, which is part of the Rand Corporation in Santa Monica. I have two comments about the sort of debate between serene and optimistic and revisionism.
I didn't say serene.
That was mine.
Optimistic. So one is, if you look at revisionism, when I think of revisionism, I think of what the Soviet Union was trying to do. They were trying to create a new international system based on new values, a new economic and political system. And you see countries forming alliances now, which, like Nina said, is what countries do, but you don't really see that kind of revisionist activity of the Soviet Union these days. I'm not saying there's the potential for that I'm not saying it's not going to happen, but at the present time, you don't see that. So there's nothing really to contain. People talk about containing China or other countries, but if they're not trying to create their own insular system, there's nothing to contain right now. And the second point, which I'd welcome your comments on, is about what we can do as sort of the dominant nation now is steps that we take will influence the degree to which other states oppose us or form their own alliances and try to revise the international system. And one example is perhaps with Latin America and what Hugo Chavez is doing down there. That's it.
Thanks a lot. And then over here.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my question. My name is Jan Robinson Flint, and I wear a lot of hats. I think I want to grow a little bit from that point he made about alliances forming in Latin America with Cuba, with Venezuela, with Bolivia, and also a little bit more, I'd like to hear a little bit more about the gender issue. And what brought that up was the question about religion and how religion impacts my life as a woman, and the internal perspective of religion in terms of when there was the first back-to-back debate in this country, or not debate, but back-to-back. It was with evangelists, and they have a tremendous influence over our lives in this country, and I think that is one of the things that is shifting the balance of power.
Thanks for those. I'm going to ask the panelists to be really quick with their responses, so we have kind of the dog that doesn't bark in the kind of contention over the international order, if there is one, and then revisiting some of the question about religion along with some gender issues, not as a clash of civilizations or basis for international conflict, but as a different shaping force, an important issue.
You know, I think on revisionism, that's probably correct, and arguably, it's been the United States actually that's done more than any other country to try to sort of change the ideological underpinnings of the world order, and that you know, I think maybe one of the most important things we need to do is be a little bit more cognizant of that, and sort of rein ourselves in a little bit and make sure we're actually moving forward and developing a meaningful global consensus as we try to change things, and not just handing down new rules and then becoming outraged when other countries that we didn't consult don't agree with, you know, ideas that are purely American generated.
Yeah, it's an interesting point that in fact the countries that are, such as Russia and China, that are now posited to be actually defending the sort of post-World War II order of respect for sovereignty and so forth, are now pitted against us as the revisionists, in a way imposing a more sort of postmodern interventionist, post-sovereign kind of worldview. And that tension is sort of characterized as ideological debate. But we're probably there's another panel that's probably going to talk about that afterwards. But there's too much evidence to the contrary in terms of this notion that there is no geopolitical revisionism going. It's happening on the regional level. It's happening in the inter-regional level. It is, it's China and Brazil. It's Iran and China. It's Saudi Arabia in all directions. The list goes on and on and on of sort of, again, this bottom-up transformation of alliance patterns around the world that adds up not necessarily to a different world order, but perhaps just a non-order. And so I don't think that we can take comfort in the notion that because, again, there is not, as I said at the very beginning, an off-the-shelf alternative world order model that is suddenly replacing ours, because that, of course, only happens after major power conflict, which hasn't happened yet, hopefully won't. But that doesn't mean that our order won't be significantly undermined. It is happening every single day.
I'd love to take issue with that, but I'm going to address the religion question. I'm not at all an expert in religion, but I certainly agree with you that that religion has a profound effect on the lives of individuals in given societies, and that it is used to repress women in many, many countries. And so it's not that it isn't an important force. It absolutely is, and we see it here as well, an important political force and an important moral force, as well as potentially a force of oppression in some cases. But I think what my co-panelists were saying earlier is that it's often also used as a proxy for a more direct political struggle, and that each side will use religion to whip up the sentiments and the emotions of one side or another, but that's not what the real battle is about. It's actually about water or territory or who gets to rule which city, et cetera.
I've really appreciated the discussion about especially the grounds for optimism versus the grounds for worry. I thought it was also a really interesting discussion about America and moral authority and whether that's a useful idea. But we did seem to have consensus, whatever the view on that, of a need for America to step back and be more self-aware, and as Robert Burns put it, to see ourselves as others see us. So thank you very much to the panelists, and thank you all for your excellent questions.